So I am Amy Burke. I am the clinical director for the Rockford and Chicago teams with ICPN, and I am going to cover for Anna Vivanti today. That's the face most of you are used to seeing when we do this sort of housekeeping in the beginning. Her office is right behind mine, so I have the pleasure of listening to her do this frequently. So I seemed like a natural sort of fill-in for her. She has been getting herself into some sort of poison ivy or poison sumac or something. And so she has a rash on her face. So she didn't want to scare everybody and show her face. So I am going to cover for her today to spare everybody from having to see her. And so I'm going to go over a few housekeeping things. Anna is on just in case I mess anything up. And then I will hand it over to the presenters for the day. So when you joined in the training, your cameras were automatically turned off. So none of us can see you if you're in your pajama bottoms or getting yourself coffee throughout this. The microphones are automatically muted, so we can't hear you either. I'm sure most of us are multitasking right now. Use the chat box function to communicate. I know that Anna put some directions in there for you on how to use that. You want to make sure that you have it set to all the panelists and all attendees so we can all interact with each other throughout this. I believe our presenters are going to take a break about halfway through. And at that time, what we'll do is we'll monitor the chat box and then present any questions to them that they may have and sort of take a break at that time. If you did not receive the presentation ahead of time, it was emailed out. However, there was about 200 people that registered. So oftentimes we make a mistake or two. Don't worry about it. We will resend the presentation when we send out the continuing ed. And so Jenny will attach that with your continuing ed. We do ask that you allow about 14 business days for us to get those continuing ed certificates out. We understand we're pushing the end of the fiscal year and most of you are trying to make sure you get the number that you need in. And so we'll get those out just as quick as we can. And so there's no need for you to reach out to us. If you are logged in today, we have your attendance automatically registered within our system. And that will then cue Jenny to generate a continuing ed certificate to you. If you don't receive it within the 14 business days, then go ahead and reach out to Jenny and we'll give you her email address in the chat box there. I see Anna just put it in there. And so it's jgraw@hope.us. And it's, like I said, it's listed in the chat box. After the training, you will receive a survey. And we are going to ask you that you take a few minutes to give us any feedback. And especially pay attention to the area about any sort of future trainings that you may have an interest in. We know that the world is ever changing as things begin to open back up. We're slowly dipping our toes back into hopefully a sense of normalcy in the past. And so what we're really looking for is any sort of trainings that may be beneficial for you guys that you're sort of experiencing in your world that maybe we could help you with bridging that gap. And so if you could take some time after this to fill out that survey and any suggestions that you have for future trainings, we would greatly appreciate that. We have been posting all of our past workshop recordings on our website, and you can view those at any time. However, we just want to make it clear that you don't receive a continuing ed certificate for viewing them. You only receive the continuing ed certificate when you're viewing them live and logged in during this Zoom training. We don't have it set up for you to view them and get continuing ed sort of on a demand system yet. So we ask that you visit our website at icpnnews.com for any upcoming trainings. And then we're working on getting a few new ones posted in the few coming weeks as well. And so right now we're working on some workshops that focus on dementia and compassion fatigue. We have another medication management training coming up, personality disorders, and then we have some clinicians working on a few others. And so I think that's sort of all the housekeeping I have, unless you guys can think of anything, or Anna, if you can think of anything I missed. Otherwise, I think I will pass it over to our presenters today. We're super excited. This is a new topic for us and a very needed topic for us. And so we have Mary and Kelly and Vicki. And yeah, I think we're super excited. We had a lot of people sign up, and so it's definitely a needed area.
Okay. Well, we will get started then. We can start with introductions. I'm Vicki Pelletier, and I am one of the clinical directors for the New Lenox SST team.
Hi, I'm Kelly Jensen. I'm a psychologist with ICPN SST. And with us we have.
And hi, I am Mary Thomas, a behavior specialist with the crisis team here again in New Lenox.
Okay, so before we get started with the content, I have been tasked with doing a big giant disclaimer for you. So this is a training that has gone through several evolutions as we have worked through it. It started out just as a training that we did for our team, because we know that the unique characteristics of some of the genetic disorders we're going to talk about can really have a significant impact on the efficacy of many of the interventions that are commonly used with folks that we're serving who may be diagnosed with autism. And just in general, some of the behavioral phenotypes and things we're going to talk about can have a significant effect on the selection of appropriate interventions to support that person. And so we started there, and then through conversations with Anna and each other, it started expanding into looking at what are the current treatments that are out there, what's the research that's out there, and kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And at this point, after really diving into it, we have come to the conclusion that we need to go back to the beginning. There is a vast amount of information out there, both in terms of research that's being done, NIH, the National Institutes of Mental Health, the National Institute of Neurodevelopmental Disorders. There's all kinds of information out there. And we decided we need to return to giving you an overview and then offering you links. And we are offering you throughout the presentation and the stuff that you got, links to the National Organization of Rare Disorders, NIMH, all of the relevant governmental links, as well as the advocacy links and research links, if those are relevant or important to you. The other caveats to that are, there's so much information that we could present to you, and we recognize each listener is different too. So there will be different things that interest you or you think are important. We're going to kind of focus on the things that were the ahas for us, that we feel like are really important to identify, that stood out for us in our research. Other things may stand out for you. The good news is the advocacy organizations for each of the genetic disorders, and obviously Autism Speaks, are very, very strong. And many of them have very elaborate research and treatment recommendations. In fact, they are probably more data-based than many of the standard interventions that are being done out there by professionals. The advocacy organizations are much more focused on the actual clinical trials and peer-reviewed research that may be there. So we're giving you links, I hope, to additional information if we don't cover things that particularly interest you or you think is important. Another important, I think, disclaimer is we're going to talk about whether it's the physical features or the behavioral presentation or comorbid conditions, what you may observe if an individual has been diagnosed with either autism spectrum disorder or one of the genetic syndromes. But as with anybody we're serving, there's a huge amount of variability within any diagnostic category. So we're going to give you some videos and things that offer you some samplings of what the behavioral presentation might look like, but every single person is different. So I think one of our priorities is to offer you tools so that you can be deliberative in your decisions about how to best serve the individuals that you are currently serving. So, and then the final thing, I think, is just on research. There's a vast amount of research out there being funded both publicly, privately, and there are huge research networks. We decided to limit ourselves to only those clinical trials that are actually being monitored through the federal government, as well as those identified, those research strings identified by the major advocacy organizations. But again, it is not intended to be all inclusive. So if you're interested, we're giving you links, go for it. And I'll apologize in advance that we're kind of dorks. And so some of the research is really exciting, but it is also gets into crazy, you know, genetic stuff that most people don't understand. We'll do our best. So I think that's it. Right?
Perfect, yeah.
Okay. And we're going to fumble around because, of course, all the links didn't work properly. So we're going to be switching screens and all kinds of stuff. So,
Correct.
all right, Kelly's going to get us started.
Good afternoon. So today, just a quick overview. We're going to go through each of the genetic disorders that we have in order of prevalence. Again, this is just a brief overview of all of them. Obviously, we could go into much more detail with each one. Each one could be a presentation in and of itself. And then we'll move on and kind of compare and contrast features of each genetic disorder with autism spectrum disorder. You'll see that there's a huge overlap with all of them. And so our goal here is to assist with identification, which ultimately will lead to assessment and some treatment and help inform that. And then we have a few case examples for a few of these genetic conditions. And then also some treatment options, what's been being done currently. And then, as Vicki just said, further research, where things are headed, and some resources if you guys want to look into that. So I do want to cover autism spectrum disorder, and just really go through everything and make sure everybody's on the same page, since we're going to be comparing and contrasting each one. So I apologize for the amount of words here on the screen, but let's go through that more thoroughly. So autism spectrum disorder, it's a developmental disability caused by differences in the brain. It typically begins before the age of 3 and it does last throughout a person's life, but symptoms can improve and kind of fluctuate over time, depending on intervention and environmental situations and such like that. Some children show autism spectrum disorder symptoms within the first year of life. Others, it doesn't show up until maybe 2 years or later. A diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder now includes several conditions that you might have used previously: pervasive developmental disorder, Asperger's disorder. That's all now under the autism spectrum disorder umbrella. Scientists believe that there are multiple causes of autism spectrum disorder, and they kind of all act together and affect how people develop. However, there's usually nothing about how people present in terms of how they look that sets them apart from other people, though they may behave, communicate, interact, and learn in different ways than neurotypical people. Abilities of people with autism can vary significantly. For example, people might have advanced conversational skills. Other people really have limited social skills, or even be nonverbal. Some people, again, need a lot of assistance in activities of daily living, and others can work and function and live fairly independently. Okay, although I just said there aren't physical features typically associated with autism, there is some emerging research, particularly in 2 areas. The CHD8 gene that regulates structure of the DNA is the closest thing to an autism gene. That was in a 2012 publication. So people with this specific mutation typically have the same cluster of symptoms in terms of characteristic facial features. They also have a lot of GI issues, particularly constipation. They also have a large head, macrocephaly, and all of these people, or nearly all of the people with this this mutation in the CHD8 gene also have autism and meet criteria for such. So that's just one. And then another gene called the DYRK1A is also another genotype where people have distinct set of features. Typically they have intellectual disability, speech delays, motor problems, and microcephaly, small head. These features are set apart from those who have other forms of autism. And they typically have wide set eyes, large ears, broad forehead and nose, also gastrointestinal issues and sleep issues. And so here, these are just two of the genotypes that we mentioned, the CHD8, and you can see some common facial characteristics between those 6 individuals on the left. And then the DYRK1A, some common facial features between those 8 individuals. Other than that, physically, there really isn't much to distinguish someone as having ASD as compared to a neurotypical population. So I thought that we could go into just some unique characteristics first of autism, and then kind of the way that we have it broken down, we'll go through some, again, physical characteristics. We have some medical characteristics, behavioral, and then we'll go into the treatment. So I just found it interesting that 31% of children with autism have an IQ of 70 or below, while 25% of people with autism have an IQ in that below average range of 71 to 85, while 44% have IQ scores in the average to above average range. And then something else just interesting is that drowning is a leading cause of death for children with autism, typically associated with wandering. And so here, males are more likely to be diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. Again, as we went through before and we saw in some of those photos, the differences between those 2 specific genotypes, one of which has a large head and the other has a small. Really no distinctive facial features, eyes, nose, ears of note within those 2. Medically, a lot of the times those with autism spectrum disorder have difficulty falling and staying asleep. They have a lot of chronic sleep issues that are usually lifelong. Sometimes it ebbs and flows, and other times they have these consistent issues. There can be seizures associated and correlated with people with autism spectrum disorder. A lot of GI issues, feeding issues, pica can be associated with autism spectrum. And then obesity, again, in addition to the GI.
Okay, I'm going to talk about the behavioral, but I just want to make a note again, given that it is fairly common for folks with autism spectrum disorder to have, in particular, GI issues, some things that can be quite painful, particularly if we're serving folks who are not able to tell us that they're in pain. We want to make sure that we are always ruling out those potential medical issues if a person is presenting with behaviors of concern. So that's just a little side note. And so we're going to be doing a table and we're going to add disorders as we go. And what you're going to find is that if there is something that's distinct for a particular disorder, we're going to highlight it in yellow as a way, again, to just offer you, if you see this, ask the next question. I'm going to assume that our audience is probably fairly familiar with the behavioral presentation of autism, so I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on it. The DMID, which is the Diagnostic Manual, the DMID is the equivalent of the DSM, but it offers some adaptations or considerations if you are diagnosing an individual who has an intellectual disability. So, but like the DSM, they identify the predominant behavioral patterns exhibited as deficits in social communication and interactions, and restricted repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. And again, as Kelly talked a little bit about it, while some of those can create behaviors of concerns, they in fact can be huge abilities, right? So sometimes there's huge amount of interest and talent and knowledge that is associated with areas that are fairly restrictive interests, but nonetheless can actually be a huge ability for that person rather than a behavior of concern. I think we're used to thinking about stereotypy and some of those sorts of things, but in fact, it can be very adaptive also. But again, I don't know that I'm going to spend a whole lot of time on it, right? I think we have all seen and served individuals who may struggle to understand the emotions that someone may be experiencing by looking at their face, perhaps not understanding those social cues that we all give in our use of the language, not necessarily understanding the physical boundaries and comfort zones for individuals. The lack of eye contact and sometimes avoidance of social interactions, I think everybody knows what it is, but I want to make sure we're going to distinguish that from Fragile X, where you see a similar pattern of behavior, but the causes are very different. So I'm just going to point that out. And then again, the need for predictability, for structure, the same schedule, the same menu, right? People struggling when there are disruptions in their schedule that are unexpected or unexplained. And I'm terrible with moving along on the slides because I get distracted with what I'm talking about. And I think we most of us have also worked with folks who show a level of sensitivity to different environmental stimuli, particularly lights and sound. But it can be across all of the senses, including movement, olfactory, right? Taste, touch. So any number of things. I think I'd like to do the video now though, Kelly.
Sure.
Right. So we have a brief video to show you just an example of the, I think you have to.
Searching it out.
Yeah. You need to share your screen again. There you go. And now go to YouTube. There you go.
Hey, Vicky, we can't hear any sound on your video. Is there supposed to be sound?
It's just a music background.
Okay.
You're not
Sorry
getting
about that.
sound
We
though?
just got a couple questions, so I wanted to ask before we went too far.
Why are they not getting sound?
I don't know. This one, it doesn't have any.
Yeah, that's for later. Yeah, but it's gonna be important later.
I want to go back, right?
Mhm.
So can you hear us currently? You were saying that you couldn't hear the video. Can you still hear us okay?
Yeah.
Yep, we can hear you just fine.
So were you hearing music or anything with
No,
the video?
nope.
Okay, that could be a problem later because we do
Okay.
have somewhere speech is important.
Okay,
Um,
we can just check those and I can let you know right away when we get to that point. But yeah,
Okay.
we can hear you just fine. Everything's going great. You sound excellent.
Okay, okay.
Well, that one was just a lovely soundtrack.
Yeah.
Okay.
You missed a nice soundtrack,
Yeah.
but there are a number of things where it will be important. So one's coming up fairly shortly. So
Okay.
so I think one of the important things in reviewing the research on autism spectrum disorder. So Autism Speaks as well. No, go back to the co-occurring.
Sorry.
As well as some of the other disorders, they have been doing what are called natural history studies, and they are following individuals with those disorders throughout their lifetime so that they can see the progression of growth, symptoms, just changes over time. And with regard to autism, I think historically there has been a strong tendency to, when we observe behavior, we would describe as anxious or obsessive, to make assumptions about that is just their autism. But the reality is there is an increasing amount of information out there that suggests that it is not uncommon for folks who may have autism spectrum disorder to have a co-occurring anxiety disorder, for example, or OCD. That's a little bit different that I'll get on my soapbox in a minute. But in particular with anxiety, I want to really encourage people to ensure that it is being evaluated to determine whether that is a separate disorder they're struggling with, and you need to get them the appropriate treatment for that disorder. So again, being deliberative and thoughtful in your treatment. What I often see, and others may disagree, with regard to OCD, it is common that I see individuals who have a diagnosis of autism to also carry a diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder. Again, I want to encourage you to make sure that someone is really looking at that diagnostically. It is common for people to exhibit highly restricted interest and activities and repetitive things around that. And they may ask 1,000 questions about the telephone or the internet or Santa Claus or whatever that may be. But that is different than someone who is having obsessive thoughts that they cannot control, that cause them to have distress, and they engage in compulsive repetitive behaviors to alleviate, and they can't stop themselves, but they do so in a compulsive fashion to manage the anxiety associated. So in that case, what we end up doing is treating individuals who in fact don't have an obsessive compulsive disorder with medications designed to treat it, when in fact we are just unnecessarily exposing them to medications they don't need, and it doesn't often work to reduce that obsessional behavior. So I think with autism, again, it's really making sure you're understanding, and it is the case for all of the individuals about whom we're going to talk. It's about the individual's why and that person, and really making sure we're not reacting to a diagnosis or to the topography with which they represent. And there is increasing information out there that there are a number of comorbid conditions we need to pay attention to serve the whole person, even if they have a diagnosis of autism. So, and then next. That's interesting, Kelly. You've got Fragile X in there too.
Yeah, I do.
But just ignore Fragile X for a moment. As Kelly talked about, they don't fully understand the causes. There appears that there may be a genetic link, and they don't really, there's all kinds of stuff out there about vaccinations and everything else, but we're not going to talk about that. But in terms of treatment recommendations, we again restricted ourselves to the government. So that's the National Institute of Health, the National Organization of Rare Diseases, because there are so many recommendations out there. We limited ourselves to just the government stuff and then the primary advocacy organization. So in general, and this is true for all of the syndromes or disorders about which we're going to speak, since there is no known cure, they identify treating symptoms. So whatever medical conditions they may have, and then again, physical therapy, OT, PT, applied behavior analysis as needed by that individual. As we work through the genetic syndromes, there are some cautions for those of us out there in the world who are doing applied behavior analysis, because there are some features, and they call them behavioral phenotypes associated with the genetic syndromes, which really cause us to need to have to change or modify or perhaps reconsider some of the traditional ABA interventions for the behaviors with which they represent. Autism, though, that being said, there is acknowledgement of the efficacy and the benefit of early ABA intervention, right? That has been demonstrated repeatedly, as well as social skills training, obviously. The advocacy organization, and again, I don't want to go into a huge amount of detail, but they've actually identified 28 different best practices that are non-pharmacological in nature when you are serving individuals diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. And this was actually a huge literature review. So there was one done from 1990 to 2011, and then a second one done from 2011 to 2017. They reviewed, and this speaks to the explosion of research with regard to autism spectrum disorder, 972 peer-reviewed articles. So that means they were in journals where they had to submit it, it had to be reviewed, it had to meet certain standards in terms of research method and everything else to even be considered. So beyond that, almost 1,000, there's a huge other amount of research that didn't meet that. So they went through these 972 studies and defined things as evidence-based practices based on a certain number of studies that were done with adequate research design, and they had very specific ways they defined it, which you can see in the link if you'd like the details. And then whether they showed efficacy. And again, I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on them. Primarily, it is behavioral interventions or aspects thereof, right? The use of behavioral momentum. So that's prompting the person to do something they're more likely to do first, and kind of working your way up to the things that are more difficult for them to do once you get them to do things that are easy and you've reinforced them and you've encouraged them. So there's 28 of those, which I found very encouraging, right? So often the research and the focus is on pharmacological interventions. This one identifies a whole bunch. And as I said, most of them are behavioral training kinds of things. There is a little bit about the use of music, but you can see that it's a very small number of studies, a total of 7 across those 17 years, whereas you see hundreds with regard to some of the other behavioral interventions. Naturalistic interventions, I'm going to put in a little tiny note about. If we have not brought the behavior change under the control of the natural contingencies, it is going to be difficult to produce long-term behavior change so that that person can live a happy, healthy life. And so it saddened me to see that there were only 75 peer-reviewed studies using natural life to help individuals' behavior come under the control of the natural contingencies. Because the generalization data with regard to the person exhibiting that behavior change outside of the training setting are not good. So let's do the training in the world within which they're going to live and be more effective. So that's me. And I can talk and talk and talk, so somebody better monitor me. Anyway, yeah, just kick me or do something. Again, most of these are behaviorally based. It was nice to see at least a little bit of research looking at parental implementation of interventions. I was also very surprised at the limited number of studies on sensory integration, given the predominance of sensory issues for folks who carry a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. So again, those are areas for future research beyond what is already being done. I was going to ask if there are any questions, but we're not going to do that now, are we? Okay, I'm going to jump right into research, right, Kelly?
Yes, and then we have that one. So that one we just played.
We just played that one. Okay. Again, as I mentioned, there is a vast amount of research out there. If you're really interested, I mean, there is a website called clinicaltrials.gov, and that lists every single study that is currently being funded in any part by the National Institutes of Health. And there's a huge number of them out there. There are only 18 that are active right now through NIH. But again, there's a huge clearinghouse. There's a lot of combined public and private research going on. And I am not going to get into all the I was going to move it, but that's not going to work. Where some stuff is blocked by our stuff. But anyway, there are whole institutes set up for autism research. There are a number of clinics devoted to autism research out there. But Autism Speaks does a nice little summary of some of the work that they have done and what they see as the major accomplishments in research into autism over the years. So we're going to go ahead and play that video for you.
Let us know about the sound, please. I'm going to share screen again. Oh, maybe not.
So I do know how to fix the sound. We had somebody in our office that knew how to fix that. And so it's just a
Can
simple
you see the
little,
video?
quick. I cannot see your video yet. Nope.
So we do have to reshare it.
The joys of technology, right? Okay, if you just want to pause that, we can't hear it. And then what you're going to do is hover up over your screen share, and you should have 3 dots where it says more up
Yep.
there. And if you scroll down from like 3rd to the bottom, it should say share sound.
Oh, I've never had to do that before.
Well, thankfully, somebody in here has been doing Zoom sessions with one of their referrals. And so she ran in and knew how to fix it. So if you want to play it
Awesome.
really quickly, I'll let you know if that worked.
Over the last decade,
did.
Autism Speaks Science has
Thank
led
you.
to major breakthroughs that are already allowing us to better understand and help people with autism. Here are 4 of those breakthroughs. The first breakthrough is early identification and diagnosis. Autism Speaks Science funded the Baby Siblings Research Consortium. This group of researchers studied the younger siblings of children with autism. These siblings allowed us to understand the early signs and symptoms and to get clinicians that information so that they could decrease the age of diagnosis. About a decade ago, most children with autism were diagnosed around age 4, 5, or even older than 6. We now know that the national average of diagnosis for autism is less than age 4. And we also know that many children can be identified by age 2. The second major breakthrough is timely intervention. Autism Speaks funded research has shown that early developmental and behavioral interventions make a big difference. Investigators such as Jerry Dawson and Jonathan Green have demonstrated that direct child intervention and parent training make lasting differences by improving a child's ability, decreasing the challenges they experience, and improving their daily living skills. The third breakthrough is understanding and treating the associated medical and mental health conditions that go along with autism. We now know that autism goes along with a number of medical and mental health challenges, including sleep difficulties, seizures, feeding difficulties, ADHD and anxiety symptoms. These additional challenges were once thought to just be part of autism. We now know that they need a separate evaluation, diagnosis, and appropriate treatment. The Autism Speaks funded Autism Treatment Network has made a major difference by educating clinicians, physicians, psychologists, speech-language pathologists about these co-occurring medical and mental health conditions. Physicians and other clinicians need to understand that these co-occurring medical and mental health conditions are not simply part of autism. They need to be able to look at these conditions separately and to be able to provide appropriate evaluation and treatment. The fourth major breakthrough is a massive increase in our understanding of the biology of autism. We now know that there are approximately 100 genes associated with autism. We're also starting to understand the biological functions and pathways that lead to autism. It's these discoveries that are going to allow us to develop new personalized therapeutics and medicines that can make a big difference in the lives of individuals with autism. Autism Speaks funded research projects such as the Autism Genetic Resource Exchange and the Missing Project, whole genome sequencing, are allowing us to understand not only the genes involved, but to uncover that biology. Understanding each person's unique biology will allow us to develop care strategies that are not based upon group averages, but rather based on each person's unique biological profile. These research breakthroughs would not have been possible without the support of so many people around the country and around the world. It's thanks to you that Autism Speaks Science is making a difference every day in the lives of individuals with autism and their families. Thank you. Over the
Okay. So back to. Okay, and just some links for you if you're interested in further researching autism spectrum disorder. I know we're all fairly familiar with it. So yeah, we'll move on to our first and most prevalent genetic disorder, which is Fragile X. So that's a genetic condition that causes a range of issues, and typically males are more severely affected because the genotype affected is on the X chromosome. So XY for males, you only have one X chromosome, whereas with females, XX, the other X chromosome can kind of compensate for that. And so that's why males typically exhibit more symptoms. So here's just a fun graphic of that, where the mutation here again on the X chromosome of that FMR1 gene. And so people with Fragile X typically present with features that you would commonly see in autism spectrum disorder. Usually there's intellectual disability associated, and then those facial features, the prominent forehead, larger ears, a longer face, or a longer jaw. Here, there's an incidence of 1 in 6,000 males and 1 in 8,000 females. So just some photos here, and you can see similar to that graphic previously of that longer face here. Some abnormalities in the hands, feet, larger ears, elongated face, facial features. So again, just of note, it's interesting that approximately 5% of people diagnosed with autism also actually have Fragile X. So you can have Fragile X and autism spectrum disorder comorbid. In men, they typically have abnormally large testes. And throughout both genders, a bluish discoloring of skin might be common. Of note here, and something to kind of separate, is toe walking is common in Fragile X, which is also a common feature in autism spectrum disorder that you might see. Cardiovascular, there's a lot of heart issues in people with Fragile X. Heart murmurs, hypertension, scoliosis, weakness in tissues, that hyperarousal, again, commonly seen with. Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. So there are some pretty significant similarities between Fragile X and autism disorder. Like obviously, you see physical aggression. We may see hyperactivity, ADHD, all that kind of stuff. SIB is a little bit less common, but will still be observed. Mary's moving around to be my audience. Is still observed sometimes with individuals who are suffering from the genetic disorder of Fragile X. You do see many of the similar behavioral. You'll see the stereotypy, you'll see hand flapping, rocking, some of those things, some of the difficulties that we see with transitions, with change in schedule. There are a couple of things that I think are important to note that distinguish it from autism. One of them is noted as prolonged hyperarousal. So, and this has implications for behavioral treatment. So there are two pieces really. There is a strong sensitivity to environmental stimuli, which is actually on the same slide, but the intensity of the response to it and the sensitivity can be much greater than we observe with some individuals with autism. So people may struggle with even the smallest amount of sounds or lights or overstimulation with movement and that kind of thing. It can trigger arousal, it can trigger agitation. And hyperarousal is a very specific condition related to Fragile X. There is an optimal amount of arousal within our bodies through our CNS system that is maintained by the body. and without getting into too many of the technical details, that system is disordered in individuals who have Fragile X by virtue of the protein that's missing on the X chromosome. And so what that means is that they are likely to become more frequently aroused, and that arousal can remain active for prolonged periods of time. And during that time, the body is in autonomic arousal, almost in fight or flight. So individuals may struggle more to manage their behavior. They have a difficult time calming down. And that can be, if we are not looking at it through the lens of Fragile X, can look like intermittent explosive disorder. It can look like aggression or agitation that may be maintained by attention, whatever environmental factors we think may be in play. But the reality, it may be that the best intervention for them is to get them out of the overstimulating environment, even though it may not appear overstimulating to us, right? So the best intervention may be simply to reduce stimulation, because their body is, by genetic determination, in a heightened autonomic state. So that's an important distinction. I think the other piece that I think is important, you do see some of the avoidance of eye contact, the avoidance of social interaction and social contact that appears like autism. But the literature and the natural history studies and things lead us to understand that typically individuals with Fragile X actually are very interested in social interactions and social connections, but there's a huge amount of anxiety related to doing so. So helping them with reduced eye contact or whatever is going to require assisting them with their anxiety related to that social interaction, versus what might be a more traditional intervention that we might do for someone who is just diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. But otherwise, as you'll see in the video, the presentation is very, very similar behaviorally, but the right intervention varies depending upon the genesis of that behavioral presentation. I already mentioned the hypersensitivity. And again, the comorbid conditions that have been identified, we're not going to get into the genetic details of it, but they distinguish between full mutation Fragile X with that protein and pre-mutation, and it presents a little bit differently. And women are more likely actually to have the pre-mutation version of Fragile X than are men. But nonetheless, either way, there are comorbid conditions that may occur separate from the disorder itself, and they need to be adequately evaluated and treated to ensure that we are providing the individual with what they need. We're moving along faster because we didn't realize that we spent 45 minutes on autism until we just looked. So in terms of treatment, again, there is no cure, but I am going to get into, in just a minute, some really fascinating research that does exist that suggests that there may be a potential cure for Fragile X not too far down the line. But again, as I talked about with autism, right, because there's so much variability in the behavioral presentation within it, the recommendations from our government are to treat the symptoms with which the person presents. PT, OT, physical therapy, ABA, you'll see that on all of them, as well as patient education. And again, with regard to Fragile X versus some of the other ones. And so I'm going to jump right to then research, and this is a different link, right?
Yeah, so this one is
Okay.
the behavioral one.
Oh, this is the behavioral one.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to get at it this way. Okay, let us know if this doesn't work. Oops, no, Kelly.
It's okay, skip that one.
Yeah, but oh, see, this is where we ran into trouble. Hang on, we're gonna have to go. For some reason, the embedded links are not loading the same way.
Yeah. I've had problems with that too.
So
Go back to our PowerPoint.
this
maybe?
was your original one. So escape this video now. There
Oh.
you go.
Awesome.
For some reason, it was loading them into opening some into one version of Chrome and others into another. So, but we
Lovely,
found
right?
it.
Both of them didn't crawl till they were 11 months old. They didn't walk till they were 17 months old.
Can you see and hear this one okay?
And
Yep,
doctors
perfect.
just kept telling me, it's a boy, he's slow, don't worry, and he was a big boy. But then language never came, and that was the hard part. And there were signs that we didn't know in the beginning, like anxiety. I remember my 3-year-old holding him, and the baby would be asleep, and someone would knock at the door, just a neighbor stopping by to say hi, and it was unexpected, and I would hold my 3-year-old, and when I would open the door, he'd throw up all over me out of anxiety. Every time. We'd go to a restaurant, and when the waitress would come to take our order, he'd throw up. In traffic, if they were in their car seats behind us in the car, if it got really bad, they'd both start throwing up and screaming and crying, and we had no idea why that was happening. At 6, he started putting words together. At 5, he started having words, and I remember I asked a speech pathologist. I took him to speech therapy 3 to 4 times a week, and I asked them, do you think he'll ever talk? And they said they weren't sure, and that was really scary for us. The key we found to get language from him is we did occupational therapy first for an hour and then speech, because with the occupational therapy, it got everything going and he was centered and he was able to then work on speech. And in kindergarten, one of his first words to his kindergarten teacher, he was having a rough time, and this is a great thing. He told her, "Shut up, penis." And I remember her calling me and telling me this, and I was mortified. I thought I was going to die. But I was so excited that he was using his words. So it's a catch-22 when they say something really rude, but you say to them, good words, don't say that. Good words, because when there's no words, so that's a really funny thing that, and you have to always look at the bright side of things, because it's not also groovy in day-to-day life, but when they do something funny, all you can do is laugh. And we laugh a lot in my house, a lot. My 13-year-old doesn't have the language skills. So what we do is when he wants something, we don't answer until we make him talk. For example, come here and show me. Come here. Come and tell me what you want. Come sit, come here. Use your words and tell me what you want.
I want blue.
You want what?
Criticism.
Tell me in words, what do you want?
Tiffany.
Mom?
I want this one.
Okay, we'll order it later, okay?
I don't want it.
Well, you have to let me finish, and we'll get it. Can I have a kiss first? Thank you.
I want a present, please.
Okay, we'll get you a present. Let me finish with Crystal, and then we'll work on it on the computer, okay? Then?
I want presents.
Okay, we'll get more presents for you. Okay, so that's what we do. That's pretty convenient. So we really have to ask him, I'm sorry.
Okay, and there's your research one.
Okay. And that one will just start. Okay, so again, Fragile X, while the research literature is not as extensive as it is for autism spectrum disorder, it has significantly increased in the last decade or so. And probably the most significant thing, and we do have a brief video about it, is they have found in the laboratory that they are actually able to reactivate the protein that is missing on the X chromosome. And so that represents for the future a potential cure for Fragile X, that they can replace that missing deletion on the X chromosome. Now, there is a parallel research which is going on and is relevant not just to Fragile X, but to all the other conditions. So it's common, according to the researchers that I listened to and read, it's really common for people to say, well, why can't you just insert the gene in there, reinsert the protein or fix that piece, that fragment that's missing. And they are able to do that with regard to a number of the genetic syndromes at the level of mice in the animal models. But the dilemma is getting that correction, so to speak, to where it needs to go. So how do you get it to the X chromosome? And so there's another line of research where they are actually using, for lack of a better word, sanitized viruses. And they're exploring how to use sanitized viruses as the medium through which you would get the gene corrections to the appropriate site. So it's actually very fascinating. And again, there are a huge number of research centers that are doing it. There's a series of collaborative centers where they're doing a multidisciplinary approach to treatment. So it's really very fascinating. The other one that stood out for me with Fragile X is they are actually looking at, again, and this is at the level of the laboratory and mice and fruit flies, actually, in this case, the impact of every single FDA approved medication on the fruit flies that have Fragile X syndrome in an effort to identify medications that may be effective. So pretty amazing, the research that is out there. Not a whole lot of research with regard to non-pharmacological interventions. And I think you'll see as we move to disorders with lower and lower prevalence, the focus is very much more on understanding the syndrome, the basic biology of it, as well as medications, because they are such a both powerful and dangerous tool in treatment. So, but this is a researcher speaking to the exciting gene stuff that's been done with regard to Fragile X.
I'm Jeannie Lee. I'm a professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School and Massachusetts General Hospital. So for the past 20 years, my lab has been interested in a process called X chromosome inactivation. And this process is a wonderful model by which to understand how genes are turned on and off. And because of what we've learned in the past couple of decades, we're in a position now to be able to turn back.
We can hear the video, but not see it.
Genes on the X chromosome that help to treat various excellent intellectual disabilities, including the Fragile X syndrome. I'm not a stranger to Fragile X syndrome. I started my research career in Fragile X as a PhD student back in
For the sake of time, I'm going to move her along so that we get only to the important stuff.
And study. We can reactivate the normal FMR1 gene in patient cells by treating with this cocktail of small molecules. And it's important to realize that there's an advantage to this strategy of reactivation because it gets at the root cause of the disorder, which is the absence of FMR1 protein. And moreover, we're doing this in such a way that we do not introduce foreign genetic material into patient cells. We're utilizing a resource that is already present within patient cells to treat Fragile X syndrome. Members here know people who have Fragile X syndrome. And in fact, I have permission to share this, but a valued member of the lab has family who's affected by Fragile X syndrome. So again, we're deeply committed to solving the Fragile X problem. I would say to families that not to lose hope, because I think we're in a position now to make a real difference to the lives of patients and to their families. So we would like to take, we meaning the scientific community, would like to take many different approaches towards treating Fragile X. And so we're taking the X chromosome reactivation approach, but there are many other ways. There's gene therapy, there's gene editing, and I think it's important for funding agencies to actually support all of these different methodologies.
So now I'm going to go back to this, right? But I'm not in slide mode, am I? Yes, okay. Okay, one really important thing that she identified is if they are successful with this research, it represents that they are not going to be introducing any foreign body into the individual who has Fragile X. So you avoid some of the issues that are inherent in the use of medications to treat the symptoms, right? So essentially they could cure it without the risk of some of the huge side effects and things related to medication. So, and now Mary, we're gonna shorten up our case studies a little bit in the, with regard to time, but Mary's gonna talk a little bit about a gentleman that she's currently serving.
Okay, so first I have the privilege of not only supporting someone who has the diagnoses of Fragile X and autism, but I also have the privilege of working with these brilliant ladies.
This is not the time.
No, I have a tie-in, I promise. So when working with Sam, I was able to compare and contrast and use the brilliance to be able to get an understanding of the appropriate way to support him, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And so that was my tie-in.
Okay.
Just because I want to highlight the uniqueness of Sam in comparison with the charts that you guys have put together. Okay. So Sam, adult male, IQ of 40. His diagnoses include a severe intellectual disability, autism, Fragile X, ADHD, anxiety, and intermittent explosive disorder, and the medical diagnoses of nocturnal enuresis, dermatitis, and constipation. So a little bit of history of Sam. Early on, he met a lot of the developmental milestones, but he always struggled with the social aspects. Thank you, Nikki.
You're welcome.
He would engage in a lot of physical aggression toward his family, and which they felt like they could not support him. And so, and he did enter into living in two group homes and things of that nature. He currently is being supported in a Scylla home right now. And the crisis team was called in to support him and the agency because of the level of physical aggression, property destruction, and SIV. So those are currently the areas in which I'm supporting Sam. Some of the other behavioral characteristics other than with the diagnoses is he does display, first, he does have the physical facial features of someone who has Fragile X. But again, the uniqueness of Sam is that when you compare him on paper, he does not have everything that's listed. So again, it was really, really interesting being able to talk to these ladies about, what's on paper of what Fragile X is supposed to be, what autism is supposed to be, and then the uniqueness of Sam, who may or may not have these features. So again, the behavior characteristics is he does display poor eye contact. With the social piece, again, Fragile X, he does really, really enjoy social interaction. And then there's a question mark of whether or not he displays social anxiety, because one of the things that I'm supporting him with is boundaries. So I've learned that in supporting him, another feature that he has is he really, really enjoys that physical interaction, being really affectionate. And so I've learned that where he has the deficits of being able to socially engage with someone, he's reaching out physically to engage. And so that has been something that has always been in his history, being really affectionate, really enjoying hugs, nuzzles, kisses, and things of that nature, to the point where, in the setting where he is now, it's not always looked upon as appropriate, but that's his go-to for social interaction.
Which was probably highly reinforced by his family, right?
Exactly. And that's what he was used to. He's lived with his family previously, up until, again, it got to a point where his physical outbursts and things, reoccurring hospitalizations, was just a little bit too much for them to support. Again, I think goes back to him being able to meet the milestones, developmentally milestones of the motor development. He's very physical. He enjoys the physical activities of basketball. He likes running. He likes throwing around a football, fishing, swimming, very physical. But again, it just points to me to the deficit of having that social delay, and he's more physical.
Also speaks to the variability within both of those disorders, right?
Exactly.
Because neither having a diagnosis of autism and a diagnosis of Fragile X, neither would lead you to think he would enjoy physical affection.
Right. So that was really, in conversating with you, it was really, that's the uniqueness of him.
Right.
Some of the things that he likes doing, he likes helping to prepare meals. He likes doing yard work, and again, physical. He some of the features of with Fragile X of having that that muscle inability, you don't see that with him. And I think, again, that was built over time because he's so physical. I'll just go now to like some of the interventions and things that I use to support him. And these are, again, things that when we're as a behavioral person, addressing the autism deficits and using visual aids. I've provided schedules. I've provided little cue cards for him to be able to appropriately explain how he's feeling with emotions. He has a sensory box. Again, these are things that I've probed with him, and that he has, for support. But he likes the schedules, but he doesn't really utilize the sensory box that much. Of course, there's a bunch of different fidgets in there, but that's not always a go-to for him. He rather have that social interaction, even if he's not communicating with the people that's around him, his peers, his staff. Just having them present in his area is comforting for him. And again, I think that goes to him not having the ability to communicate like you and I, but just having that someone in his area is comforting to him. And as a behaviorist, taking into consideration, all the features of all the diagnoses, we have to be conscious and we have to be aware that it might be, as you were saying, that anxiety piece, because one of the things that he struggles with or areas and we're supporting is him and his ability to transition from not only one place to the next, but one activity to the next. The transition of staff coming and going and shifts are struggles for him. So again, not necessarily looking at, the external piece, but being aware that there's an internal piece. And that's a lot of times, again, I'm guilty as from a behavioral. So we're looking at the four features, the functions. Is it access to attention? Is it access to a tangible? Is it, it's just being aware of that it might be something internal. But we're so quick to go to what's external.
So the topography.
Exactly. So this was really, really helpful with me being able to support Sam and able to share this also with his SILA staff, because again, we're constantly looking at what we can do outside, externally, the environment, versus understanding, hey, there's that anxiety piece. So I know you might have questions for me.
No.
No.
You did fine.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah. I think Mary did a really nice job of showing us just the variability, right? I've served a number of people, and again, other ends of the continuum. One gentleman, we literally had to establish a one-person SILA because even the sound of a housemate who was soft-spoken, spent a lot of time in his room, would trigger this man to engage in very severe SIB to the point that he was risking his vision. I've served two sisters, which was strange enough, right? I mean, it's rare. And they were the opposites of one another. One of them was working in the community, listening to music all day long with their headphones on, joking, laughing, social with her posse at the table. And the other one spent most of the day crying, either because she was overwhelmed by her environment or because of her anxiety and her thoughts about the health and safety of her loved ones that were not nearby. And so again, just the range of individuals, and both of them, all three of them, on the surface, if you didn't know, presented as though you would have said they were autistic. And they needed an entirely different level of support because of the co-occurring genetic syndrome that they had. So we are at 2:20, ladies. Kelly, do you want to just talk about tuberous sclerosis quickly, and
Sure.
then we take a break?
Sure.
Because there's really not a whole lot. We included it because the impact of this syndrome can be profound depending upon which systems are affected.
Mm-hmm.
But what it looks like depends upon which systems are affected. So Kelly's just going to do a little brief overview, and I think we'll skip even doing the behavioral piece,
Sure.
right? Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Mary.
Yes, thank you.
So tuberous sclerosis is most commonly characterized by growth of benign tumors that can affect virtually every part of the body, most commonly in the skin, brain, kidneys, and internal organs. And then, like what Vicki said, it can lead to varying health complications dependent upon where those benign tumors are. It also leads to developmental delays. It often occurs or is comorbid with a lot of psychiatric diagnoses as well, dependent upon their physical presentation, can lead to depression, anxiety. So here are just some pictures. Probably pretty painful as well.
Probably fair to assume particularly if tumors, and they have some of the skin conditions associated with it, that there's some history of trauma, bullying, teasing, all those things.
And here in the brain, so commonly it leads to seizures and seizure disorder. It can lead to renal failure, kidney disease. I think the video we have is of a young man who experiences chronic epilepsy, uncontrollable seizures. And of note here is 40 to 50% of people with tuberous sclerosis also meet diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum disorder. So here again, those raised thick bumps or discolorations, tumors, again, typically benign, but not always. Here, seizures are present in 90% of people with tuberous sclerosis. It can lead to hydrocephalus, increased cerebrospinal fluid, increased risk for certain kidney cancers, sensory motor dysfunction. And do you want to skip right to that video then?
I think so. You know, as Kelly said, there are significant numbers of, you can imagine, depression, emotional responding, affective disorder, social withdrawal associated with tuberous sclerosis. The good news with regard to treatment is that they actually have FDA approved some medications specifically to treat some of the most common tumors associated with this syndrome, whereas that is not the case, for example, for autism or for Fragile X. Autism, there are a couple for specifically the irritability.
I can't remember exactly, but I think I first met Manny when he was just a few years old. He had actually been diagnosed as having tuberous sclerosis even before he was born, because his mom knew she had it, and a prenatal ultrasound showed that Manny had cardiac tumors as a fetus. But he didn't come to the CRS clinic until he started having seizures, which was probably around age 1 or 2.
Tuberous sclerosis ranges in symptoms from mild to more severe. The more severe symptoms of tuberous sclerosis are caused by these benign tumors that appear in the patient's brain, heart, and kidney. And when they appear in the brain, they can cause the patient to have severe seizures.
Manuel has seizures called complex partial seizures. And every day he has a struggle because he doesn't understand the illness. So I have to kind of explain to him, you know, what stuff he can and can't do, because there's some limitations to with the tuberous sclerosis that leads him to having struggles every day, like academics and, you know, just personal needs.
Patients with TSC can inherit tuberous sclerosis complex from their parents 1/3 of the time. And in the other 2/3, they develop this disorder just on their own, so it's new to them.
I was first diagnosed as a child myself. I had seizures, I had grand mal seizures. I had outgrew my seizures, but Manuel has seizures 2 to 3 times a day. And the neurologist is like trying to find more options because they're running out of options on medications.
But I think what we are trying to do, you know, our goal is really to discover a method of blood testing in children as soon as they're born. Not necessarily to make the diagnosis, but really to provide a way of predicting disease severity and also provide a way of, you know, treating the patients.
Okay. So again, brief overview of tuberous sclerosis.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned, right, most of the research, understandably, is really focused on managing the medical conditions that can be produced by it. And as I said, the good news is they actually have FDA-approved specific medications to deal with some of the most common medical conditions associated with it. So, and again, I think I mentioned, so they are also doing some of what they call translational studies and things where they're evaluating the effects of medications not normally prescribed for other conditions for efficacy. So immunosuppressants in this case. And there were just a couple little studies on ABA, but that was it. So, all right, I think we're gonna take a break. It is 2:28. So can we say 2:43?
Yeah, sure.
2:45, we'll call it 2:45.
And then we can come back and answer whatever questions you may have. So see you soon.
I do have a couple of questions. Or is it okay to ask those now?
Yes, please.
Okay. So the first, they both sort of focus around that beginning part where you guys focused on autism. And one of the first questions was about sort of the difference between what you think of as OCD and then just those characteristics of somebody that has a diagnosis of autism, and sort of how to differentiate the difference, or what is the difference. I think that there's often a lot of confusion with, you know, can somebody with autism also be diagnosed with OCD, or is that sort of just a manifestation of the spectrum disorder? So do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Sure, I can speak to that.
great.
It is sometimes hard to distinguish because a lot of the times those with autism have a lot of ritualistic and repetitive behaviors, those stereotypies. Someone with OCD will typically have above and beyond. And what Vicky was saying earlier are a lot of those obsessions or things that you're thinking of can sometimes be hard to access in someone with autism. And so you're looking for things that kind of go above and beyond, right? So I'm thinking of an individual that I supported with autism spectrum disorder who had the typical like hand flapping, a lot of the difficulties with communication, but he also very clearly had OCD. He would be up and out of his bed and trying to fix his sheets just so. And then he would lay down and then like something wouldn't feel right. Like you could just see it in his eyes, and he'd get up and fix his sheets. And so functionally he was losing sleep because he could not get out of these compulsions that he was engaging in order to kind of ease his anxiety. And so while it can be hard to kind of differentiate between the two, yeah, it's kind of just an above and beyond kind of what you would expect to see.
Okay.
Autism. Okay.
That sort of segues naturally into the next question. There were only a couple of questions the first half. I suspect as you get into some of the more unique diagnoses, there'll be a few more. But the next, the other question that somebody had was, and I think it's talking about that first video you played where there was just the musical background, but we couldn't hear that. The comment, question was that, some of the things displayed are things that you would see out of a lot of children, right? Like a sensitivity to noise and, wanting things in a certain way and order and, adjusting, doing better with a schedule and things like that. And so at what point does that sort of become an issue for people?
Good question. So I think, again, functionally, when things kind of get in the way, right? So aligning those things and seeing a lot of distress and meltdowns, not just a tantrum, but meltdowns over, things being out of place or things differing from routine, unable to be redirected. That social as well is really a big thing with autism spectrum disorder in children, right? So we think of the lack of eye contact, the lack of emotional reciprocity, a lack of that shared experience between children. Again, just kind of above and beyond that typical rigidity that you would see in toddlers.
Sure. Sure.
And I will say that some of our videos do focus solely on children, but it also applies to adults. And some things can kind of shift or present differently in adults. And of course, not all of these videos are comprehensive of everything. But I think it was portraying mostly what we were trying to get across.
Sure,
Oh,
sure.
I agree.
And it
I know
seems
when
like
we first
people have
started,
a,
it was that running. I was with 2 3-year-olds on Monday who just spent 45 minutes running around the same path.
Right.
But it's the combination of all those things together, I think, as
Okay.
Kelly said, with the emphasis.
I think
on
that's
the-
important to keep in mind, that it is a combination. It's not just running, right? That's not a big deal. It's the running, the organization, sort of the inability to focus on other things in the environment and move from one task to the next.
Right.
No, great. We're getting a lot of good feedback. Everybody's really enjoying it so far. And so those were the only 2 things that came up thus far. And so, you know, if you guys leave time at the end, I can ask any questions that come up at the end.
Okay.
All right.
That's good.
So we'll move on to Williams syndrome, which is the next prevalent of our genetic disorders that we have here today. And it's typically characterized by growth delays, both while in utero and after birth, displaying short stature and varying degree of intellectual disability. They also have distinctive facial features that we'll cover. And let's see. Okay,
There we
good.
go.
So here you can see with these 6 beautiful people, a narrower face, particularly at the temples, a short or upturned nose, kind of a rounded button nose, an upturned mouth, big wide smile, and a smaller jaw.
People describe it as elf-like,
Mhm.
right? There's a sweetness. Oh, the eyes. Did any of them have it?
Ah, good point. So we can go back to that. Oh, that one worked. Here, yeah, I don't know if you can see, but in
No.
the eyes, there's sometimes a star-like pattern in the iris.
Almost looks like a starburst, but
Yeah.
but you can't really see it in that photo, in those photos.
Sometimes people with Williams syndrome can be difficult to point out just on the surface, particularly because they have can have such advanced language skills. When they have strengths in language skills and communication, some of their other deficits, you don't really notice right away, right? If they're unable to really process with you, or time orientation or things like that, that doesn't really come across in general everyday conversation. They may initiate conversation with others. They're actually overly friendly, right? Which can be both a blessing and a curse. They're particularly good with facial recognition, short-term and auditory memory. They do have perceptual difficulties, difficulties with hand-eye coordination, and fine motor control.
The language piece is definitely a distinguishing characteristic for Williams. So with all of the other disorder and syndromes we're talking about, they're typically significant speech delays or impairments. Whereas with Williams, you may see individuals who are highly articulate. But as Kelly said, that masks the level of intellectual disability and the struggles that they may have with some processing kinds of issues.
Mm-hmm. This particular genetic disorder is represented equally across males and females. So physically, we talked about this, that the elfin-like or cute kind of cutesy features, a star-like pattern in the eye, in the iris. Typically, those with Williams syndrome will start to have premature graying of their hair and an early development of secondary sexual characteristics. So body hair, muscular build, men will start to have broadened shoulders earlier. Excuse me, please. Women will have widening of hips earlier and breast formation earlier.
And those again are distinct for that disorder.
Mm-hmm. They also typically have, they physically feel sound. Sound can be very painful. They have this heightened arousal to sounds, everyday sounds, cars, the microwave, something like that. Also common in Williams, they have a lot of heart and cardiovascular issues. We were speaking about this beforehand, and Williams syndrome to me sounds a lot kind of representative of people with Down syndrome, right? So they're overly friendly, love people, love engaging with people, and they also commonly have issues with their heart as well. So it's recommended that people with Williams are really monitoring their cardiovascular health. They can also have some bladder issues and bulging of pouches of their bladder and of their GI tract. They can have awkward gait. So not so much that toe walking, just kind of their gait can sometimes be off. They will sometimes kind of be colicky, particularly in infancy. Again, relating back to those GI issues, vomiting, gagging, have diarrhea or constipation. And so sometimes people will just think that they're just colicky or think maybe they have some sort of dietary intolerance when in all actuality, some of this is kind of going on beneath the surface. This is yours. Sorry.
Okay. Well, we already mentioned the communication piece, right? That the individuals may be highly fluent, highly articulate, and very social and friendly and very, very engaging. Present potentially with ADD or ADHD, but this is also a little bit different. So for individuals with Williams syndrome, they may have a difficult time switching or disengaging their focus from whatever they are focused and interested in versus retaining their focus on a particular event issue. So that is, again, a distinguishing feature of Williams. And again, as you'll see, the grayed out boxes in our table mean that has not been identified as, and again, as we've moved into the syndromes, they're technically called behavioral phenotypes, but we'll talk about behavioral presentation in general. So SIB is not identified as a critical part of that cluster of behavior typically observed in individuals with this syndrome. Kelly mentioned the excessive friendliness, and it again is adorable, and you'll see the video of it. They're very engaging, but getting into adulthood as well as children, it puts them at pretty significant risk for exploitation. And there also can be many social issues, even though they're very social and engaging, but it can result in intrusiveness, being intrusive, invasive, and other people's where that socialization is not welcome. So if you get on their advocacy website, they talk about physical aggression, bullying, some of those things related to the fact that their child is so friendly and so outgoing. Again, there's this weird interest in faces. But then the other thing that really stands out with regard to Williams syndrome is they talk repeatedly about, they call it enhanced musicality technically, but it doesn't mean that they are necessarily more talented musically, but there is a tendency to have strong emotional responding to music, and a great joy found in music, also sadness, but again, a more emotional response than is typical for neurotypical or other individuals. Again, we've already talked about some of the social stuff, and they didn't go so far as anxiety, but there's a tendency to worry even if it doesn't meet the clinical criteria for an anxiety disorder. So you may see in a child just a tendency to be more of what we call a worry wart casually. Combined with the, I don't know if you remember up above, right? We talked about hyperacusis, right? So there is this thing with auditory stimuli for individuals with this syndrome. So they are drawn to it, they're interested in it, but at the same time, as we move down to these comorbid conditions, there is a tendency to have very specific phobias, and typically those are around sounds. So there's something very auditory that is affected with this particular syndrome. And again, when we talk about hyperacusis, and I looked it back up again to make sure. So as Kelly said, it's not just sensitivity to sound. It's like you closing that dishwasher door is deafening to me. So what are typical sounds or soft sounds to the rest of us are almost overpowering to the person and will in fact cause pain, anxiety, irritability, discomfort. Not quite, what is the one? Oh, well, I'm not remembering. There's another one where it produces agitation and aggression, but that's not quite there, but it is actually painful. And then again, if we see the comorbid conditions, we've already talked a bit about anxiety, right? Both anxiety with regard to specific things, but also generalized anxiety disorder, which is not typical with the other syndromes that we are reviewing. So again, that pervasive constant worrying could potentially be a clue to what an individual may be experiencing. And again, I guess we didn't talk about IQ before for Williams. You may see individuals who do not have an intellectual disability all the way the range to a severe intellectual disability. Okay, and then treatment looks about the same. Again, no cure, they don't understand it. Williams is one of the disorders where I think they identify 28 different genes within the 7q11.23 chromosome that may be relevant to Williams syndrome. When we see this, and we're going to see this with a couple more of the syndromes we're going to talk about, that exciting gene research and potential intervention by correcting the genetic anomaly is not really possible, right? So it's one thing to say, as we can say with Fragile X, that the protein is inactive or missing, and we just need to replace that one protein on the X chromosome. When you're talking about 28 different ones, they are not making the same kind of progress with regard to treatment or with regard to research around potential gene therapies for Williams syndrome. But I got a little bit ahead of myself. I apologize. One of the specific ABA interventions that is recommended for Williams is the use of desensitization to address those specific phobias. Here's my little soapbox. While it can be very effective, please ensure that you have supported the person in acquiring the coping skills necessary to manage the distress to which you are going to expose them prior to initiating desensitization. But we put it in here because it is pointed out as a unique and specific ABA intervention that has been identified as effective. The advocacy group, Williams Syndrome Association, also recommends the use of music therapy. I'm not sure that the research at this point bears that out, and I'll just move to the research. Oh, no, I won't. Okay, we're going to do the video first, and I would love to get people's reactions. So we're telling you this is Williams syndrome, would you think it was Williams syndrome, or would you think it was autism if you saw it without context? Okay, wait, now I gotta share.
This is the checkers game where grandson and granddad will bond. This is the kitchen where the
Oh, now what?
Small
Here.
set of genes
Yep.
surrounding the elastin gene
Oh,
in
there's the cute
chromosome
lady.
7. We have 30,000 genes in the brain. We're talking about 20 or 25 genes in one little place on one particular chromosome. And it turns out that when that is missing, when that lops off in the very, very earliest stages, it gives rise, wherever that occurs in the world, to an individual with a very unusual profile.
Really? Great smiles.
I want to know your definition of what Williams syndrome is.
Okay. Williams syndrome is a birth defect I was born with.
Most people with Williams syndrome love interaction. They love engagement. They love to catch your eye and get a smile. And I almost feel like that's candy for them. It's like, oh, good, I caught another smile. Or like someone fishing, I caught one and it felt so good.
If I ever get a chance to actually go in a real recording studio with a big bass fiddle, believe me, I'll call you so I can record with you, man.
I work at Cracker Barrel. I'm a greeter.
Ooh, I bet you're good at that.
I am. I always take people to their tables, and I make everybody happy. I heard nice compliments. The bosses are very happy, and I make everybody happy. I'm a happy man for the rest of my life.
Williams people are very musical. They love music, they love arts, they love dancing, so that's a very cool thing about Williams syndrome.
I think there is something special about Williams syndrome and music in a couple of ways. I mean, so many people with Williams syndrome have intense emotional responses to music, intensely happy. So I just think a lot of people with Williams syndrome feel music more emotionally.
Tell me about your love for music.
Oh, music to me is like the soundtrack of the world.
What do you say about the challenges of Williams syndrome? How would you characterize those?
Well, there are many, different challenges. When you get to see someone who has Williams syndrome, it's like a whole different world.
Now you do it, Ben, and stay on the road. Oh, you went off the road a little bit. Let's try it one more time. We're going to take it.
Students with Williams syndrome have a difficulty focusing. They are known in general to have poor focusing ability. It's compounded by an inability to filter out other students in the room who may be working on a different project, and because of their hypersensitive hearing, they can often even hear things going on in the hallway or in the classroom next door, and those all become distractions.
When you test a child with Williams syndrome, you might get an overall IQ.
Got it. Okay. So I mentioned earlier, right, that as the prevalence of the disorders decreases, the extensiveness of the research and what is actually being learned also changes. So I didn't mention it when we talked about autism, but NIH lists 1,200 research studies out there with regard to autism. There are 20 with regard to Williams. And again, most of them are focused on medications, either to manage behavioral stuff, so things like Buspar, Risperdal, Prozac, but again, also with regard to the significant cardiac issues. There were maybe 3 studies out there on ABA and cognitive therapy. So not enough to really say definitively whether there was benefit or there was not. They are, in fact, though, a number of really exciting things happening. Like I've never heard of this before, but the Chromosome 7 project is out of Toronto, and they are creating an international database where they are dumping anything and everything that has ever been learned about the disorder in order to sift through that and really see if they can shorten the period of time between the initial research questions being asked and moving into clinical trials. Because obviously in our current environment, there's limited funding for research. So a lot of the advocacy organizations are really trying to focus their limited dollars on doing smaller research grants on potentially promising things, and then getting results that will then allow them to secure NIH funding and other funding to do broader clinical trials. So even though they have done very little in the sense of a huge number of studies, they're very aggressively opening some different research centers around the country and internationally. I mentioned the Harvard Medical School one. So they're really trying to accelerate that in those initial stages of research. And again, looking at a wide range of things, from the anxiety, looking at music therapy, looking at music therapy and anxiety management, looking at some of those relationship issues, but there really isn't enough definitive body of research out there that they're able to make significant conclusions, right? And again, there's less emphasis on attempting gene therapies or gene modification because they don't fully understand the disorder itself. And that will be the case for each of the next 4 we talk about, that quite a bit of the research is really still focused on understanding the basic biological foundations of the syndromes, rather than, way back when I did 28 different best practices that were non-pharmacological for autism. These guys are nowhere near there, but they are, I think, learning lessons from their brothers and sisters in these larger advocacies to make sure that they are using those research dollars really responsibly. So there you go. Again, some links for you. All right.
Next is Cornelia DeLange. And I think this one is most identifiable if you're just walking down the street and you see someone. Again, this is a genetic disorder that leads to affecting many different parts of the body. It can range from mild to severe in all symptomology. And this one, again, also has slow growth in utero and after birth. People are typically shorter in stature. They typically have intellectual disabilities ranging from moderate to severe ID. A lot of abnormalities in the bone, specifically of the arms, hands, fingers, sometimes even in toes and feet. They also have distinctive facial features that we'll go through.
This is the one of all the other ones we showed you. I honestly couldn't say that I could distinguish between the different faces. This is the only syndrome that I can say I could easily, but anyway, go ahead.
No, that's good. So here they have typically thick eyebrows and they meet in the midline, a very concave nasal bridge and an upturned nose, a long, thin or even indistinct philtrum, and downturned corners of the mouth. And in the graphic up to the left, you can see that the upper limbs have some abnormalities, either malformation of the hands or some splitting or fingers being fused together. Here's another one. So here are the toes fused together. It's interesting, this one and one more that we'll get to have, it's typically the second and third toes that are fused. And the eyelashes.
Beautiful eyelashes.
Yeah. Here again with the upper extremities of the arms or hands. Thicker brow. Okay. And so as we go through these, we're adding a column to each. And so you can kind of compare and contrast with all of them, specifically with autism, because so many of the features are overlapping or indistinguishable. And so our goal here is to kind of help differentiate that to best support the people that you're serving and to ensure the best treatment as well. So this one also is equal across males and females. Here in the eyes, there's a nystagmus or an involuntary eye movement. As you saw before with the mouth, it's kind of small, the downturned outer lips, low set ears. Again, the joining of second and third toes, either missing fingers or having some abnormalities. Things being underdeveloped, short in stature. Again, that nystagmus or involuntary eye movement here. Underdeveloped genitals, abnormal placement of actually the urinary opening. Let's see. Again, GERD. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Again, I think it's interesting that across all of these disorders thus far, we have that GERD or that GI stuff that's kind of always going on. Hernia is very prevalent here. Feeding problems, risk of intestines kind of twisting in and around itself, causing some obvious pain or hernias, as we saw before. Fluctuations in weight depending upon GI issues. Here they have hypertonia, that increased muscle tone, whereas some of the others have hypotonia, that decrease in muscle tone. And with that, they can kind of have some contractures, and then also kind of going into that malformation again of the hands or arms. With this, particularly related again to that GI, we keep going back to that. The GERD issues can lead to obvious dental problems and pain with that, and making sure that you're getting that treated or ruling out anything there. Cooler extremities, I thought was interesting. Lack of blood flow to the extremities there, and this one potentially forceful vomiting.
Okay, and then behaviorally, again, there are some, the behaviors typical of autism aren't necessarily observed in their full amount. So like you don't see the stereotypy of sorts, but you will see perhaps a fascination with particular kinds of things where you see that sort of staring off, and you may see some stereotypy associated with those gazes and things. You know, some of the, again, as we go across, ADHD, very, very common, right? You do see some SIV. It is typically directed at those upper limbs, again, that tend to be also deformed. Speech impediments, pretty common. I don't think I was able to find a video that actually represented the low-pitched, but when parents described it, they almost described it as cat-like or growl-like, like a small dog or a cat sort of growling at you. So again, it's just a very unusual vocalization that may be a sign if they don't have the more obvious physical features, right, of Cornelia de Lange. As they grow up, you may get more hoarse speech, which is only really associated with this or Smith-Magenis, I believe. So that while it's not unique enough to be highlighted yellow as it's the only one, it is also one that could be a potentially distinguishing behavioral feature. I can't see what that says, Kelly, because it's cover. It's the one I already talked about anyway. You do see some smiling, some decreased facial expression, some of those things that you would see also. Some of the repetitive behavior, all that kind of stuff. No, go back. I'm sorry. There we go. Yeah, they are not necessarily showing anything beyond a few of the typical, stereotypical behaviors that we see with regard to autism. In terms of co-occurring conditions, oh my gosh, I got it all goofed up again. And as the table progresses, you will see we ordered it again in terms of similarities, right? So again, anxiety is identified as a pretty significant co-occurring disorder. OCD-like behavior, ADHD, and autism, all as potential comorbid or co-occurring conditions. We're not going to spend much more time on Cornelia de Lange because, again, most people present with the physical characteristics. So that is a good distinguishing feature for you. Where did our video go?
2 or 3 more slides from here.
Oh,
Next one. Actually, it's the next one.
I thought it came before treatment. Yeah, I think it makes sense to do it before treatment. Did we get out of order or am I just?
And arms in the same way that other people do.
Because it comes out of nowhere. She'll be happily playing and she'll suddenly start to bite herself. She does bite.
Let's see.
Tendencies too. In terms of social behaviour, we see enormous variability. This is primarily related to whether children fall within the autistic spectrum. If they do, then we will see impaired sociability. On the other hand, it's very clear that we do see children and adults with Cornelia de Lange syndrome who develop friendships and relationships in the same way that any other children and adult may do so.
We had some issues with her in those early stages. She would try to do things with other kids by using touch, for example, and she would reach out to touch somebody's face, and of course there's panic involved, and then there's panic involved, you move a lot faster. So we had problems with some other kids at the time.
The only strain I think we could ever say is emotional, where, you know, she gets upset because she hasn't got so many friends as other people. Every job that she'd ever been to, at first she was very, needed my support mentally, really, that was all.
Most people love her because she has got a smashing sort of temperament. There's no nastiness in it. I mean, her brothers and sisters will take toys off Bethany and she doesn't get affected by it like where, as if it happened the other way around, they would. She just sort of lets them get on with it and she'll go and play with something else. She's very, very nice from that point of view, you know.
They don't like change. They don't like change. But once they're in change, I find with Tracy anyway, well, once the change has happened, she's adapted so quick like that it was like there was nothing.
She likes things to be ordered and to do at 3 o'clock in the afternoon what she did at 3 o'clock in the afternoon yesterday and the day before that. So she has a number of routines that she goes through. If we do buy anything new, it stays in a wardrobe for about 6 months while she gets used to the idea of it being in there, and then suddenly one day she'll wear it. Once she starts wearing it, it's very difficult to get her to stop wearing it. It will be, you know, every other time. As soon as it's washed, it's back on again.
CDLS children tend to have a high pain threshold, and self-injurious behaviour is not uncommon.
A lot of the self-injury that we see in Cornelia de Lange syndrome is directed towards the hands and the fingers, biting and picking. Now, when we've tested children and we measure the speed of nerve impulses in their arms, around 80% of children show very slow nerve impulses. And this may mean that they're not experiencing pain in their hands and arms in the same way that other people do.
Because it comes out of nowhere. She'll be happily playing and she'll suddenly start to bite herself. She does bite herself and she kicks her feet and kicks the skin off her feet. But I think it's because she's in pain all the time.
We've always been able to use distraction with Thomas. If we see him biting, we distract him with a toy or
So again, I saw that one in particular had a lot of commonalities with some behavioral presentations in autism, right?
Right.
A lot of the difficulty with change and rituals, a lot of routine.
Yeah, I don't know if people could hear, right? They have to keep it in the closet for a few months to get used to it. Once she embraced it, no letting go, right? Then it becomes almost obsessional. So, which really it wasn't identified in the features reviewed by NIH in different places, but okay. Okay, so again, the treatments, same kind of thing, right? Treat the symptoms, if they need speech, OT, all those kinds of things. Because of the potential severity of GI issues, that was highlighted both by NIH and by the advocacy organizations to make sure that you are carefully monitoring both GI and cardiovascular issues for obvious reasons, not only health, but they can have such a significant impact on how well people are able to get through their days. They recommend early intervention, they recommend skill building, and then treating the comorbid medical conditions in terms of the advocacy recommendations. Again, at this point, we are down to only 4 studies, again, in contrast to 1,200 with autism. And as I mentioned earlier, they're really at this point, really focusing on understanding the diagnosis and most of the basics related to Cornelia de Lange syndrome. So they have not, I mean, you can see one study was evaluating the effects of a hormone on self-injurious behavior. There were actually a few studies that had to be terminated with these smaller syndromes because of the inability to recruit enough subjects before the funding ran out. So they're just getting started, but they're working on it, starting with the pervasive medical stuff and then related medications to manage that before they do a whole lot in moving on with assisting with some of the behavioral presentations. So there you go. Lots of links.
Mm-hmm. Okay, next up is Angelman syndrome. And this is obviously another genetic disorder that primarily affects the nervous system. Features of this include developmental disability, intellectual disability, a lot of speech impairments, issues with movement and balance, seizures, epilepsy, small head size, microcephaly. And here it's sometimes recognizable as early as 6 to 12 months. Other common signs and symptoms usually appear in early childhood. And so here you have what's notable most to me, at least, is that wide smile with teeth evenly spaced and kind of separated.
Whereas with Cornelia Lang, you saw the more jagged, right, tooth structure.
Sometimes a sunken nasal bridge again, a smaller chin, seizures common. Okay. And again, of note here that I thought was interesting, 50 to 80% of people with Angelman show symptoms of autism spectrum disorder. They also have decreased excitability as they age, and their sleep also improves with age, which is something
nice to see.
Yeah, uncommon with a lot of the other ones that we're looking at. Again, equal across all genders. Again, that microcephaly, commonly they have a flat back of the head. They have, again, that nystagmus, that involuntary eye movement, a lot that we've, well, in Cornelia. Delaying, we just saw that as well. Deep set eyes is common. A protruding tongue, again, within that wide mouth and wider set spaced teeth. Usually they have fair, pale skin, lighter hair. A decreased need for sleep here, but sleep does get better as they age.
But again, note every single syndrome or disorder about which we're speaking, there are likely to be issues with sleep. And we all know how sleep deprivation or unstable sleep affects how we respond to those around us. So again, making sure we're treating the whole person. If someone is sleep deprived, getting them help with that may help them much more than a contrived intervention to manage irritability.
Right, again, treating those symptoms, right? There's no cure, there's no treatment for Angelman's, but treating all of those individual symptoms within here. Also interesting, they have exaggerated reflexes. This is one, so a lot of these have atypical gaits, but this one in particular, they look kind of drunk, kind of swaying back and forth. Yeah, that jerking movement. Kind of with that, they have a slowed speech, a slur, that slow movement as well. Also a sensitivity to heat is something that stands out here with Angelman's.
Okay, again, we have the same kinds of communication delays that we talked about. You will see some physical aggression, hyperactivity. SIB is not typical for individuals with this syndrome. You will see a preoccupation with shiny things. So again, there are some strong features with autism. And again, I'll challenge you on this video too. If I didn't tell you it was Angelman, what would you think it was? One thing that is fascinating, so Kelly talked about the decreased need for sleep. You see very frequent smiling, laughing, kind of bouts of incongruent laughing and smiling where you can't figure out what is so amusing to the person. And they seem to be at times somewhat cyclic in nature for individuals. So it has not been stated definitively, but there is some question about whether bipolar disorder may almost be inherent in Angelman syndrome in a different way than the comorbid conditions with other syndromes. But they haven't been able to disentangle it. Again, it's a rare disorder. There's not enough research and stuff that is out there. But again, we've identified there's the stereotypic hand flapping. There may be difficulties in reading emotion or facial expression. Some of those things that we see fairly typically with folks who are have an autism spectrum disorder. Again, some of the same environmental sensitivities that we are likely to see. So that is, again, pretty pervasive with a couple of exceptions, right? So we should not assume because somebody puts their hands on their ears in a loud environment that that's indicative of autism. And I'm sure people aren't, so I apologize too. Again, the only comorbid conditions that are identified are ADHD and the question of, is there in fact a more direct relationship with a bipolar disorder? So let's can you do the video? I don't know why, I don't like that order anymore.
That's okay. I don't either.
And this one should be, oh, you're the two.
I love my sibling because he always comes to hug you and smiles a lot. Sometimes it's a bit annoying when he hugs me because he might dribble on you or something like that.
Likes to chew his clothes a lot.
Likes playing with water.
he will splash you a lot.
They tend to love their food, looking at pictures. They love reflective surfaces.
I would describe her as a toddler with 8 years worth of experience of life.
They are very inquisitive. They like to touch things and work out how things work.
The focus of attention will just flit back and forward between things.
It's very complex. I think he's got a full personality. It's not just the laugh or the smile. He has strong emotions. He's growing up.
It's really hard to tell what's Ewan and what's Angelman syndrome because the two are so interlinked.
We have to give him like a sleeping cushion, so then he would go to bed easier.
So management of sleep is complex and often families need some help with that. Many children just simply don't need as much sleep.
Sometimes he wakes up at about 3 in the morning. That happens at least once a week.
He's very hyper. I know children with Angelman syndrome who run. They don't just walk, they run.
She gets around very well on her own by crawling, by holding onto a handrail, but mostly by holding onto the hand of a supporter.
Sports day for us is something that it's a day that Jack absolutely loves. He runs virtually every race, whether he's supposed to be in it or not.
And once he decides that he doesn't want to do something, he just gets on the floor and lies there, and you can't get him to stand up, whatever you try and do.
Supermarket trips in general are very entertaining, where he can reach both sides of the aisles. He'll happily empty the shelves, empty everybody's basket as he's walking around.
He might nick someone's thing from their bag and then try and either eat it or throw it on the floor or chew it or something.
If she wants attention, sometimes she'll bite, but not very often.
You put a piece of paper down, she ripped it. You put your best china out, she'd break it.
Families would describe Angelman individuals as pretty stubborn or determined.
Lots of children display behaviours that could be considered challenging, and that can include things like physical aggression, biting, pulling hair, and this is obviously really distressing for the families.
We find that if we create a lot of activities and always make sure that he's entertained, we don't get challenging behaviour. It's really a sign of boredom and frustration.
Find the right things for them to enjoy, and he will sit nicely.
And even if he can't get out of his buggy and run around and play with the other children, he really likes to be included and he really likes watching them play.
She loves the dog's fur, just likes to yank the tail, but the dog and her are best mates.
And he reaches out and grabs people either with his smile or with
Okay. Again, the treatment recommendations are essentially the same as everybody else, right? Treat the symptoms. There is no cure. The advocacy organization is advocating at this point for gene therapy. And so I'm going to jump right to research. Again, tiny number of studies. They are really focused on the biology of it. But Angelman is one of the syndromes where they have been able to identify a very specific gene, and it is the UBE3A, the maternal copy. So in we humans, the paternal copy is called silent, so it has no impact. If the maternal copy has been deleted or is damaged, they actually just in October of last year announced at the University of North Carolina that they had been able to activate the paternal gene that is missing or damaged on the maternal side. So they're really excited, again, like we are with Fragile X, that they feel like if they can figure out how to extend the benefit that they are seeing in the animal models. And I believe with Angelman, did I note it, that they have actually been able to reduce the severity of the symptoms pretty significantly. Yes, the severity, literally, they have seen reduced behavioral presentation, which is different than with Fragile X. they have not gotten to the point of actually seeing a reduction in symptoms. So they feel like they're getting closer. They are just now doing, well, not just now doing, they're doing the natural history study, which I talked about, where they're following people from as young as they will participate through their lifespan. Unfortunately, because it's so small, they started in 2006, funding ran out, but it has been reinitiated, I think, in 2019. So that whole project, again, to better understand the foundations of the disorder are happening. So not a lot out there, but what's out there is promising. So in terms of potential cure.
More links.
Okay, man, okay, we will try to do this one fairly fast. So we have a few minutes for questions.
Last up, Smith-Magenis. Again, genetic developmental disorder, affects a lot of parts of the body. Mild to moderate ID, delayed speech and language. We see a lot of distinctive facial features. There's that sleep disturbance again, and behavioral. So in Smith-Magenis, the mid-face is particularly flat, especially at the bridge of the nose. Prominent cheeks, high cheekbones, a full or pushed up upper lip, and a prominent, strong jaw. And again, you can see some abnormalities or differences in extremities as well, hands and feet in particular, some irregularities in the ear. This one, to me, there aren't a lot of overlap. Yeah,
I can't see it.
Yeah, not with this one.
I'm not good at
Initially, people with Smith-Magenis, as is probably true for a lot of these, are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And so this can go undiagnosed, or people just aren't treating all of the symptoms effectively, appropriately. Some cool things about Smith-Magenis is that they have great long-term memories. They have good perceptual closure. So what that is, if they see a picture and part of it is missing, they can kind of fill that in accurately. So if I only have half of a circle, I mean, that's a simple one, but they can easily identify that it's a circle and fill in that other half, or identify what from that environment is kind of missing to complete that whole picture. Contrarily, they have weakness of short-term memory and sequential processing, particularly with numbers and letters. Here, unfortunately, SIB tends to increase as they age. Equal across genders here. We went through some of those facial features, but the full cheeks, high cheekbones, that flattening of the midline of the face. They can have uneven eyes, either that strabismus or the nystagmus again. Sometimes eyes here can appear bulging or enlarged. Quite a wide set eyes, deep set eyes. Again, all these ones that we're seeing here of stature, typically short stature, not a lot of growth, both in utero and after birth and continuing on. Here's those webbed toes, again, between the second and third toes that we see here, and also with, what is this other one? Let's move this.
Cornelia delay.
Thank you. Sorry. Smaller hands and feet, again, with Cornelia delaying, you kind of see that as well. Dry skin, I think we saw in the pictures previously, some open wounds, things that don't heal very well. Another one with that hoarse or deep voice like you would see in Williams. That circadian rhythm is a really prominent feature here with Smith-Magenis. So 90% of those with that have an opposite circadian rhythm. And so they're tired during the daytime and they are awake at night. But of course, it's not just that easy. They also have all of these other conditions with sleep, right? So difficulty staying and falling asleep, a lot of daytime fatigue, and so doing a lot of behavior therapy and things with that around sleep scheduling can be very important in helping these individuals. Seizures, again, also common here. Myopia, vision problems. Again, we see a lot of cardiovascular abnormalities and difficulties. Again, there's that GERD, chronic constipation and GI issues, feeding problems. They can either have commonly flat or high arched feet. There doesn't seem to be a midline for that. They have hypotonia, which is common in all the others, except for whatever one we just did that I can't see.
Yeah, we're
the Angelman, sorry. Scoliosis here is common, as you can tell, across at least 4 of these genetic conditions. Things with the vertebrae, hypothyroidism, high cholesterol. In the video for this last one, they had the decreased pain, and that's common here as well. Sensitivity to hot and cold, again, dental issues commonly related to GERD, nocturnal enuresis, and frequent sinus infections, which is interesting.
Okay, I'm going to try to shorten this up so we can do the video and have a few minutes for questions. Smith-Magenis, the individuals can present with some very similar stereotypies, SIB, some of those things. There are a few things, though, that really distinguish it. So there are 2 forms of SIB that are very common in Smith-Magenis. The first being insertion of objects, so literally in whatever orifice it may be. That is a distinct form of SIB that is not correlated with any of these other conditions we've discussed today. And then there is a tendency to pull out their own fingernails and toenails, and sometimes teeth. And again, it doesn't appear from what I've read and families with whom I've spoken that that is something that is done during periods of agitation or distress. It doesn't necessarily fit the environmental conditions under which we see other behavior we would describe as SIB. But I mean, one of the moms would say, oh yeah, I came down today and I saw I pulled out another one, you know, and there was just no indication of anything. And the skin picking, I do also want to mention, because it's not what we typically think of, you know, people that might pick their cuticles until they bleed or pick a scab. At times, individuals can pick so much that they create an open wound, and then they continue to pick and cause it to become even a larger wound. So it is skin picking, but it's of a different intensity and with very different consequences. So there can be a lot of infections and obviously all those things that are related to open wounds, nail beds that are now exposed that shouldn't be exposed, some of that kind of stuff. So I also want to, I'm going to talk about the circadian rhythm thing right now because it's also part of the research. So Kelly mentioned that it is reversed. Literally what that means is that their melatonin is highest during the day when we're all awake and lowest during the night. So that is identified as the biggest issue for the individual as well as for families and should be for clinicians, right? So you can imagine the person is up and active and running around and playing and eating and drinking and going in and out of the doors. You know, I served a gentleman because there is also a tendency to have restricted interests that are very intense, who would be out checking for letters from Santa Claus at the mailbox at 4 o'clock in the morning, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times. You can imagine that that family is not having much sleep. You can imagine that during the day when this kid was at school and people are trying to prompt him to pay attention and to focus and to engage in his work when everything in his body is telling him to be asleep, pretty challenging. And no behavioral intervention for on-task behavior is going to be effective if his body is making him sleep. So when people are being treated with this disorder without a knowledge of the pervasive impact and their sleep patterns, it's easy to go awry with your interventions because many of the behaviors that are presented with Smith-Magenis appear very volitional and behavioral in nature. So this is one where it's pretty important. Now, obviously, these are pretty distinct target behaviors or behaviors of concern that if exhibited, the person should be evaluated. And we didn't really go through it for all of these, but in most cases, there are blood tests. So it isn't that the diagnosis is done both through a clinical examination and some blood work. It's a little bit more. Smith-Magenis has a very, very sophisticated advocacy group, PRISMS, which is very focused on the scientific research. So their assessment, actually diagnosis, includes CT scans, MRIs, because they've really made some gains in that arena. But this is one where you'll see a lot of the repetitive stuff. You'll see they do this self-hugging thing, which on the one hand looks a little bit like stereotypy, but it is of, again, a distinctly different form. You still might see some of the stereotypy that we see with autism, but it has a different topography to it, which is very distinct to this disorder. Oh, well, here we go. The other thing that is very distinct is it's called licking and flipping. And I wrote flicking in all the documents because it just made sense to me. Constantly flipping magazines. So people will just lick their finger and just click through it. And again, a gentleman I worked with, that was the greatest joy in his life, was to get the newspaper every day. So he could go through all the coupons, right? And he would flick through. And he was actually a pretty cool dude, but I'm not going to get into any of the details because we'll never get to what's much more interesting for people. So there are some very unique behavioral presentations. With regard to the circadian rhythm, there's a lot of research out there on melatonin. I did a bunch of research on behalf of this gentleman, and melatonin seems to have mixed efficacy for people, which is not uncommon because, as we've talked about, the divergence in symptoms within each disorder. For a while, for about a 7 or 8 year period, there was a lot of research going on about the combination of beta blockers and melatonin, that they had actually been able to successfully reverse the circadian rhythm back to what is more typical. But then somewhere around 2015, it just disappeared. And so I thought it was really promising. In this gentleman's case, he had some pretty significant respiratory issues. And so his medical comorbid conditions made it pretty risky to use beta blockers in that combination for him. But I still can't figure out what happened to that research because it looked really, really promising. But a lot of the research in the area is, again, around it in general, really trying to figure out how to overcome that sleep issue. We're getting an unstable internet, so I hope we don't lose you guys. And then they just recently have started a clinic and research consortium, again, to streamline that process whereby you start with small studies to get to clinical trials and more effective treatment. So I'm going to stop there so you can watch the video and we can do a question or two.
So today is a very special day for me. It's SMS Awareness Day, also known as Smith-Magenis syndrome. Now, many of you may know my older sister Brianna has SMS, and she is a lot of the reason why I moved back to Central New York. Now, I think she is very special, and I want you to see just how special she is. And I also want you to learn a little more about her and how underdiagnosed her disorder is. happy, affectionate, excited, and
My heart will go on.
loud are some good words to describe my sister Brianna. She's 29 years old and has Smith-Magenis syndrome. She was diagnosed at age 11. SMS is a chromosomal disorder. It's a deletion of chromosome 17. According to prisms.org, SMS occurs in 1 out of every 15 to 25,000 births. It's usually confirmed through a clinical blood test. Some of the symptoms you might see in people who have the disorder are repetitive self-hugging, difficulty paying attention, and get this, flipping pages in books, which is one of her favorite things to do. Now, each individual has an obsession. Some like washing machines or computers, but Bree happens to like phones. She will ask you every question in the world about your phone. She also asks, "Is that new?" or "Not here." Once we learned she had SMS, we started going to conferences to see how we could give her the best care. We are learning new things every single day, and it's a lot of work, but we wouldn't trade her for anything. The endless hugs, which are amazing, the constant phone calls, and the "I miss you, sissy" comments are something I will always have.
I missed you so much. I want you to.
Well, actually, we're kind of done. Okay, we have 5 minutes.
Let's see. So we've also included some general links, as you can see here, that aren't specific to any genetic disorder, but just for your reference and for resources.
And just as a side note, unfortunately, you will not find, with regard to the genetic syndromes, one single location within the federal database where you'll find everything you need. So you may find some things under NIH, and then there's other pieces about, for example, Williams under NDAs, and then there may be some under the Eunice Shriver Child and Adult Development. So, and then there will definitely be some in NORD, which is the rare diseases. So you have to wander around a bit. There is a lot there, though, that is very valuable. So, any questions?
Just a couple, if you don't mind. Do you have time for just a couple?
Of
course.
Okay, great. One of the things that they were talking about in the chat box is any sort of genetic testing. Do you know if there's any available for any of the different syndromes that you talked about today at all?
Yes, I'm sorry. I guess I didn't make that as clear as I intended to. For all of the genetic disorders, the diagnosis is based on both a clinical examination and there are blood tests.
Okay,
to
great.
identify. With regard to Smith-Magenis, there's some additional CT scan and MRI stuff, but in all cases. Unfortunately, that is not the case for autism, other than with regard to those two very small genetic, which are maybe 1% of all individuals with autism. So with autism, we're still relying on just the clinical examination, but there is blood work to confirm the occurrence of any of the genetic disorders.
Okay, great. Then there was just a lot of a conversation in the chat about, people sort of reminiscing and talking about the special individuals that they worked with as you were sort of going through the different syndromes and adding, the happiness and the different sort of nicknames that the syndromes had been given. And so that was kind of endearing to read, as listening to people sort of reminisce about people that they currently work with that are dealing with some of those issues. There was, I took a phone call, so I was multitasking for just a second, but I think there was some discussion about sleeping with that last syndrome that you discussed. Do you have any recommendations specifically for dealing with sort of that disrupted sleep pattern, or anything that you have seen that works specifically with that?
Honestly, I'm a behavior analyst. I tried a number of sleep hygiene things with them. We tried exercise. We had him on a pretty good regimen of walking a couple of miles a day, limited caffeine consumption. We can't battle biology, right?
Sure.
We did things to minimize the parents' engagement with him when he was up during the night. But the reality is, for most parents, if their child is a child that's going to explore or leave the home, no one's going to sleep well. So I think really working with their physician, most of the research is on melatonin, and it is mixed. There wasn't much out there like on trazodone, Seroquel, some of those other things, Benadryl being used. And again, there was that line of research. I don't know where it went. It just disappeared off the face of the earth. So,
okay. Well, that was really it. Lots of positive feedback, lots of thank yous. People learned a lot. And so I think that this was great. It was something that we've never really, discussed before within ICPN, sort of bringing them all together, and sort of, I like how you built upon it with that graph. And so, excellent. And so I just want to, a couple of housekeeping things, remind everybody that, again, you'll receive your continuing ed in about 14 business days from Jenny Graw. And if you don't get it within the 14 days, then go ahead and reach out to her. Again, you guys are going to get a survey that pops up when you leave this, and any other things that may be beneficial to you, sort of drop us a note, and we would love to see if we have tons of clinicians on staff throughout the state. We may find somebody that can work on something for you. And so thank you all for joining us. Thank you guys for an awesome, excellent presentation, and I think ending everybody's day learning a little bit. So have a great day. Thank you.
So can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Did people see autism in those videos where I asked you? Did people see a distinction between Angelman's and autism? Because I don't see it behaviorally. Oh, I guess they didn't. Well, we didn't have the chat box open.
Okay.
So,
there was a lot of comments about, really liking the videos, and I think it's good to hear about things and then sort of be able to see that.
Mm-hmm. Good. Well, we enjoyed doing it, I think.
No, awesome. Yeah,
very much. That's a lot of information, but
can you not close us until we can look at the chat? Is there a way to do that?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a good day.